Snow drifted across the high ridges of the San Juan Mountains, sweeping over the frozen ground in long white sheets as the first members of John C. Frémont's expedition tried to force their mules through the narrowing trail. The sun was low, its light pale and sharp, reflecting off the snow until everything around them looked bleached and icy. Their boots punched through the crust with every step, sinking into layers of powder that hid rocks and holes beneath. The temperature had already dropped far below what any of them expected for early December. Frémont rode near the front, watching the weather build across the distant peaks, while trying to ignore how quickly the wind strengthened along the exposed pass. This was the fourth expedition he had led into the West, funded partly by wealthy backers who wanted a new railroad route across the Rocky Mountains. He had promised them a line that would cut straight through Colorado's high country. Local fur trappers warned him that winter storms hit the San Juans early and without mercy. They told him to take a southern route or delay until spring. Frémont believed his party was strong enough to push through before the worst weather arrived. He carried that confidence with him as the men climbed higher, unaware that the storm already forming above them would soon erase the trail and everything they thought they knew about the mountains. As they advanced up the pass, the wind strengthened into a steady roar, pushing snow sideways in sudden bursts that blinded the men and spooked the animals. The mules slipped on ice-covered rocks and balked at the steep pitches ahead. Fires sputtered and died in the rising wind, leaving the men to eat cold rations before crawling into thin blankets that did little against the biting cold. By morning, several animals had frozen where they stood, their bodies stiff beneath a crust of snow. The men dug shallow pits for shelter, but the storm swallowed those too, filling them in before they were finished. The expedition pressed forward because turning back seemed just as dangerous. The snow deepened to the men's waists in places, forcing them to take turns breaking trail. Some began to lose sensation in their fingers and toes. Others developed a cough that worsened each night. The air thinned as they gained elevation, and the sun grew weaker behind the storm clouds. When the men tried to light a fire again, the wood snapped from the cold, and the flames died almost instantly in the wind. The temperature dropped even further that night, cold enough that one man woke screaming when he realized his feet were completely numb. Another tried to stand in the darkness and fell unconscious in the snow. He had to be dragged back under the blankets. By the middle of December, the expedition was trapped on the ridge with no clear route forward. Frémont ordered scouts to search for a way down, but they returned half-frozen, reporting only steep drop-offs and snow-choked canyons. Rations were nearly gone. The animals, now too weak to carry loads, collapsed one after another. The men butchered what they could to stay alive, cutting frozen meat from the carcasses while fighting off wolves that emerged from the timberline during the night. Still, the food was not enough, and the storm did not break. When frostbite began blackening skin on fingers and toes, the men understood the danger more clearly than any warning could have offered. They spoke in low voices around what little warmth they could create, discussing the possibility of splitting into smaller groups to search for lower ground. Frémont resisted the idea at first, afraid that dividing the party would doom anyone who wandered too far from the main group. But the storm pinned them down for days without relief, and the men were already starting to die. One by one, they succumbed to cold and exhaustion, their bodies wrapped in blankets and buried shallowly before the wind carried snow over the graves. Finally, Frémont made the decision to abandon the main route entirely. The surviving members gathered what supplies they could carry and left the rest behind. They moved down the ridge in small steps, lowering themselves by branches and rocky ledges, sliding where they had no choice. The snow was so deep it swallowed the men to their chests in places, forcing them to crawl. More men collapsed on the descent, their strength drained by weeks of starvation. One man froze upright against a tree, discovered only when another stumbled into him in the whiteout. The dwindling party tried to keep talking to one another as they moved, knowing that silence in the snow often meant someone had fallen behind or stopped breathing. As they dropped lower into the timber, the wind weakened and the storm shifted south. The trees, heavy with snow but sheltered from the highest gusts, offered just enough cover for fires to take hold again. The surviving men huddled close to the flames, thawing their hands and trying not to think about the trail of bodies left behind them in the mountains. Days later, half-starved and barely conscious, the first survivors reached a small settlement near Taos. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes torn, their bodies wrapped in makeshift layers of buckskin and blankets. Locals rushed them indoors and tried to revive them with warm broth and blankets. Some recovered slowly, others never regained full sensation in their extremities. When rescuers returned to the mountains to search for the missing, they found scattered remains along the ridges, frozen equipment buried in drifts, and the carcasses of animals that had collapsed during the descent. They uncovered the shallow graves where the earliest victims had been buried, and farther up, they found men who had simply sat down in the snow and never risen again. The scale of the disaster became clear only when all survivors were counted. Of the roughly 33 men who had set out with Frémont through the San Juans, at least 10 died in the storm, and many more suffered lasting injuries. Frémont survived, but the weight of the expedition hung over him for years. He later admitted that the route had been a mistake, and that he should have heeded the warnings of those who knew the mountains better than he did. The survivors remembered the bitterness of the cold, the endless white horizon, and the feeling of digging through snow while hoping each step would finally lead them downhill. For the men who lived, the memory stayed with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of how quickly winter in the high country could turn an ambitious journey into a desperate fight to stay alive. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.